The house on the edge of the meadow had always been a place of comfort for me. It was my grandmother's sanctuary, a sprawling, time-worn home surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Every summer, I'd visit for a week or two, and it became my escape from the chaos of my parents' lives and the relentless march of city noise. But this summer, things felt different. I wasn't a child anymore. At 19, the world was starting to open in ways I hadn't fully grasped. And yet, stepping into her home still had a way of pulling me back to simpler times. Grandma Margaret, Maggie to everyone else, was as sharp as ever at 68. She moved through life with a grace and determination that made it easy to forget her age. She'd spent years alone after my grandfather passed, but she never seemed lonely. The house reflected her, orderly, vibrant, but with a quiet undertone that hinted at stories untold. It was a place that seemed to live and breathe with her presence, shaped by her routines and her laughter. I arrived late in the afternoon, the golden hour casting a warm glow over the house. She greeted me with a smile, her arms pulling me into a hug that felt as familiar as the scent of lavender that always lingered around her. Her hair was streaked with silver now, tied back neatly, and her eyes carried the same quiet warmth I remembered. She was different, though, subtly, in ways I couldn't immediately place. Maybe it was the confidence in her movements, or the way she carried herself, but it unsettled me in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. She insisted on making dinner that night, shooing me away when I offered to help. I sat at the old kitchen table, the same one I'd drawn pictures on as a child, and watched as she moved about the kitchen. Her hands worked deftly, chopping, stirring, her every motion precise and deliberate. She hummed softly under her breath, a tune I didn't recognize but found strangely comforting. It was easy to fall into silence around her, to let the world narrow down to the crackle of the stove and the clink of utensils. The meal was simple but perfect, just as it always was. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from her garden. We ate in the dining room, the windows open to let in the cool evening breeze. She asked me about school, about my plans for the summer, but her questions didn't feel intrusive. She had a way of drawing you out without making you feel exposed, and I found myself talking more than I'd expected. After dinner, we moved to the porch. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of pink and orange in the sky. She brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and sat in the rocking chair beside mine. The air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass, the sound of crickets filling the silence. We didn't speak much, but we didn't need to. Her presence was enough, steady and grounding, and I felt a calm I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When the night deepened and the stars began to dot the sky, she stood, her movements slow but deliberate. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, following her back into the house and up the stairs to the guest room that had always been mine. The bed was freshly made, the familiar quilt draped over it. I lay down, staring at the ceiling as the quiet of the house enveloped me. But sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts were restless, turning over memories of the day and the subtle changes I couldn't quite place. She was the same, but not. Her presence felt different now, fuller, like it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. And as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer would be unlike any I'd spent here before. The next morning, the house was quiet except for the faint hum of birds outside the window. I woke early, the light just beginning to filter through the curtains. The cool air carried the scent of lavender and fresh linen, and for a moment I lay still, letting the calm of the place settle over me. But my thoughts were restless, pulled back to the subtle tension I had felt the evening before downstairs. Grandma Margaret was already awake. She stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with a practiced ease, her hair pinned back neatly. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard my footsteps on the stairs, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, setting a plate on the table. The smell of fresh coffee and syrup filled the kitchen, mingling with the golden morning light. Her presence was effortless, commanding the room without trying. I sat down, the quiet clink of silverware against plates filling the silence as we ate after breakfast. She handed me a list of tasks to do around the property: trimming hedges, fixing a loose fence post, and hauling firewood to the porch. I welcomed the distraction, eager to lose myself in physical work. The sun climbed higher as I moved through the list, sweat gathering at my brow as I worked beneath its steady warmth. Every so often, I glanced toward the house, catching a glimpse of her through the kitchen window or stepping out onto the porch to check on me. By mid-afternoon, the sun had dipped behind a cover of clouds, and the air turned cooler. I finished stacking the last of the firewood and leaned against the porch railing, catching my breath. She appeared then, carrying a tray with a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. "You've been working hard," she said, setting the tray down on the small table between the rocking chairs. "Come sit." I obeyed, sinking into one of the chairs as she poured the lemonade. The cool drink was a welcome relief, and for a while, we sat in comfortable silence, watching the wind stir the tall grass in the meadow. Her gaze seemed distant, thoughtful, and I found myself wondering what occupied her mind. As the afternoon stretched on, she suggested we walk through the garden. The neatly kept rows of vegetables and herbs were bordered by a patch of wildflowers, their bright colors a stark contrast to the orderly green. She moved through the space with a quiet reverence, pointing out the tomatoes that were ripening and the mint that had started to overtake its corner of the plot. At one point, she knelt down to pull a few weeds, her movements slow and deliberate. I stood nearby, unsure of what to do, but the sight of her there, so grounded and in tune with her surroundings, stirred something in me I couldn't quite name. She looked up, catching my gaze, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to still. "This place has always had a way of grounding me," she said softly, brushing dirt from her hands as she stood. Her voice carried a weight I hadn't noticed before, as though she were speaking to something deeper than the moment. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and followed her back toward the house. That evening, the house felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the sun dipped below the horizon. We ate dinner in the dining room, the warm light of the chandelier casting soft shadows on the walls. She asked about my friends, my studies, but her questions felt more like an invitation than an interrogation. I found myself sharing more than I had intended, her quiet attentiveness drawing out thoughts I hadn't realized I needed to express. After dinner, she brought out an old photo album, the pages worn and the corners of the pictures slightly curled. We sat together on the couch, the album balanced between us as she flipped through the pages. Her voice softened as she told stories about my grandfather, about the early days of the house and the life they had built together. Her laughter was light, but there was a wistfulness to it, a quiet ache that lingered beneath the surface that I found myself leaning closer, caught up in her stories and the way her eyes lit up as she spoke. The lines on her face seemed to fade, her presence filling the room in a way that felt almost magnetic. I couldn't look away, my attention drawn to the way her hands moved over the pages, the faint tremor in her voice as she recounted memories that had shaped her when the album was closed and the stories had been told. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. She rested her hand on mine briefly, a gesture so simple, yet filled with a quiet intimacy that sent a shiver through me. "Thank you for listening," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my throat tight as I tried to form a response. But the moment passed, and she stood, her movement slow as she gathered the album and set it on the shelf. "You should get some rest," she said, her gaze meeting mine for a lingering moment before she turned toward the stairs. I watched her go, the quiet click of her bedroom door echoing in the stillness of the house. The night stretched on, the sound of the wind in the trees filling the silence. I lay awake in the guest room, my thoughts a tangled web of emotions I couldn't untangle. There was something different about her this summer, something I couldn't ignore. And as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the boundaries between us were shifting in ways I didn't yet understand. The following day began with a haze of golden light streaming through the windows, illuminating the stillness of the house. I awoke earlier than usual, the quiet urging me out of bed. The memories of the previous evening lingered, her stories and her touch replaying in my mind like a melody I couldn't shake. I found myself drawn to the kitchen, where the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the cool morning air. Margaret was already there, her back to me as she stood by the window, gazing out at the fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back loosely, and the sunlight framed her in a way that made her seem almost ethereal. She turned when she heard me, a soft smile curving her lips as she gestured toward the coffee pot. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and steady. I nodded, mumbling a reply as I poured myself a cup. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. We sipped our coffee in the quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room after breakfast. She suggested we tend to the garden. The rain from the previous days had left the soil soft and fragrant, perfect for pulling weeds and planting the late summer blooms she had been saving. I followed her outside, the sun warming my skin as we worked side by side. She showed me how to gently coax the roots from the ground, her hands deft and confident as she moved through the rows of vegetables and flowers. That was a simple task, but it felt intimate in a way I couldn't explain. The brush of her arm against mine, the way her laughter carried on the breeze, the small smile she offered me when our eyes met. It all felt charged, like there was something unspoken passing between us. I tried to focus on the work, but my thoughts kept drifting, drawn to her in ways I didn't want to name. As the sun climbed higher, we took a break beneath the shade of the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the garden. She brought out a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses, and we sat together on the grass, the dappled light filtering through the leaves above. She leaned back against the tree trunk, her posture relaxed, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out over the fields. "It's days like this that remind me why I stayed here," she said after a long pause. Her voice was quiet, almost wistful. "The world moves so fast, but out here it's like time slows down. You can breathe. You can just be." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Her words resonated with me, though, settling deep in my chest. There was something timeless about this place, about her, that made everything else feel distant and unimportant. The afternoon passed in a similar rhythm, the hours blurring together as we moved from one task to the next. By evening, the house was filled with the comforting smells of dinner: roasted vegetables, freshly baked bread, and a stew that had been simmering on the stove all day. We ate together at the small kitchen table, the warm light of the chandelier casting a golden glow over the room. Afterward, she suggested we sit on the porch and watch the stars come out. The air was cool, the sky clear and dark, and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. She brought out a blanket, draping it over both of us as we sat side by side on the old wooden swing. The fabric was soft against my skin, and her warmth beside me was both comforting and disarming. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds, and for a while we sat in silence, simply watching. But the quiet between us wasn't empty. It was alive with the weight of everything unspoken. I could feel her presence beside me, every small movement she made sending a ripple through the space between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You've grown up so much, you know. I barely recognized the little boy who used to run through these fields." Her words sent a shiver through me, and I turned to look at her. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon, but there was something in her tone that made my chest tighten. I wanted to respond, to say something that would bridge the gap between us, but the words caught in my throat. The moment stretched, heavy and charged, until she finally turned to me, her eyes meeting mine. The look in them was unreadable, but it held a depth that left me breathless. The world seemed to fall away, the only sound the faint creak of the swing beneath us. "It's getting late," she said softly, breaking the spell. She stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and offered me a small, almost shy smile. "You should get some rest." I nodded, my heart pounding as I watched her disappear into the house. The porch felt impossibly empty without her, the night suddenly colder. I stayed out there for a long time, staring up at the stars and trying to make sense of the storm inside me. The boundaries between us were shifting, and I knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning carried a weight I couldn't shake. The sun broke through the clouds in pale streaks, casting the house in soft, diffused light. I had spent most of the night awake, my thoughts swirling in an endless loop, replaying every moment from the porch swing to the way her gaze had lingered on mine. There was something undeniable between us now, an undercurrent that neither of us had spoken aloud, but both felt that I found her in the garden again, kneeling among the rows of flowers she had so carefully tended over the years. Her hands worked deftly, pulling weeds and trimming leaves, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look up as I approached, but I could tell she knew I was there. Her presence was magnetic, pulling me toward her despite the turmoil in my chest. "You're up early," she said finally, her voice calm and steady. She glanced over her shoulder, offering me a small smile before returning to her work that I didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say. Instead, I knelt beside her, reaching for the small spade she had set aside. We worked in silence, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the faint hum of bees drifting through the air. The quiet between us was heavy but not uncomfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to break. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, and the heat began to press down on us. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands and motioning toward the house. "Let's take a break," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that sent a shiver through me. I followed her inside, the cool air of the house a welcome relief after the intensity of the morning. She set a pitcher of iced tea on the kitchen table, the condensation dripping down its sides. As we sat, the sunlight streamed through the window, catching in her hair and casting a golden glow across her face. I found myself staring, unable to look away, until she met my gaze and smiled softly. There was something in that smile, a quiet invitation, and I felt my chest tighten. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet moments and shared tasks. We repaired the fence along the back meadow, her laughter breaking the silence every time one of us slipped or stumbled. We walked the edge of the property, her voice soft as she recounted stories of my grandfather and the life they had built together. Each word felt like a thread, binding me closer to her, pulling me in her world in a way I couldn't resist. That evening, the air was cooler, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. She suggested we sit by the fire pit in the backyard, a small circle of stones that hadn't been used in years. She brought out a stack of firewood and a box of matches, her movements purposeful as she built the fire with practiced ease. I watched her, captivated by the way the flames reflected in her eyes, the way her hands moved with a confidence that seemed effortless. We sat in the flickering light, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between us. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the flames, and I found myself stealing glances at her, the way the firelight danced across her skin, the soft curve of her smile. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet anticipation that made my heart race. She turned to me suddenly, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "You've grown into such a remarkable young man," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Her words hit me like a wave, and I felt my throat tighten. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and she smiled again, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, a spark that lingered long after she had pulled away. The fire burned low as the night deepened, the shadows around us growing darker. She stood finally, her movements slow and deliberate, and looked down at me, her expression unreadable. "We should head in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I followed her back to the house, the cool night air wrapping around us as we climbed the porch steps. She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on mine for a moment before she stepped inside. The house felt impossibly quiet without the crackle of the fire, the stillness pressing down on me as I made my way to my room. But sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in the weight of everything that had passed between us. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear were now blurred, and I knew that whatever came next, there was no going back. The final morning at the house was wrapped in a thick, suffocating quiet. The kind of silence that seemed alive, pressing against the walls, the floors, and the air between us. The sunlight poured in through the lace curtains of the kitchen as I sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Margaret moved through the room with her usual grace, her movements deliberate and composed as she prepared breakfast. But there was something different in her demeanor, a kind of stillness that felt like anticipation, that we barely spoke as we ate, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound that filled the room. Every now and then, I caught her eyes on me, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than it should have before she quickly looked away. The tension was palpable, an almost physical weight that settled over the house. Growing heavier with each passing hour after breakfast, she suggested we take one last walk through the meadow. The idea seemed innocent enough, a simple way to enjoy the warm summer morning. But something about the way she said it, the quiet insistence in her voice, the softness in her eyes, made my pulse quicken. I nodded, setting my cup down and following her out the door. The meadow was alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of tall grass swaying in the breeze. Margaret walked ahead, her steps light and purposeful, her hands brushing against the wildflowers as we made our way toward the old oak tree that marked the edge of the property. I trailed behind, watching her, the curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head as she turned slightly to glance back at me. Her presence filled the space around her, radiating a warmth that seemed to draw me in with every step. When we reached the tree, she stopped and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows across her face, highlighting the faint lines that marked the years she had lived and the quiet strength she carried. She smiled then, a soft, almost wistful curve of her lips, and gestured for me to sit beside her on the grass. That we sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. The wind whispered through the leaves above us, carrying the scent of earth and summer, and I let myself breathe, trying to steady the storm inside me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the way her proximity made my heart race, the way her presence seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer to the edge of something I couldn't name. She broke the silence first, her voice soft but steady. "This place has always been special to me," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It holds so many memories, so much of who I am. And now it holds you too." Her words sent a shiver through me, and I turned to look at her, searching her face for some hint of what she meant. But her gaze remained on the meadow, her expression calm and serene. I wanted to say something, to respond, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the emotions I couldn't yet articulate. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness or longing or joy, but something deeper, something that felt like all of those things at once. Her hand reached out then, her fingers brushing lightly against mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. We sat like that for what felt like hours, her hand resting lightly on mine, the world around us fading into a soft, muted blur. The weight of everything we weren't saying hung between us, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a bridge, a connection that had always been there, but was only now coming into focus. When we finally stood, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting the meadow in a warm, golden glow. We walked back to the house in silence, the unspoken bond between us stronger now, unbreakable. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know what would come next, but I knew that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone back at the house. The day passed slowly, each moment stretching into the next. We moved through the familiar routines of preparing lunch, tidying the kitchen, and tending to the small tasks that had always defined life here. But there was an ease to it now, a quiet understanding that neither of us spoke aloud, but both felt deeply. The by evening, the air had cooled, the sky streaked with shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Margaret suggested we sit by the fire pit again, a way to mark my last night here before I returned to the city. She brought out a blanket and a bottle of wine, her movements unhurried as she poured 2 glasses and handed one to me. The fire crackled softly, its warm light casting flickering shadows across her face. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the flames, and I found myself watching her, captivated by the quiet strength and grace she exuded. She looked at me then, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I'm going to miss this," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. "I'm going to miss you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, and I felt the ache of them settle deep in my chest. I wanted to say something, to tell her that I felt the same, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for her hand, my fingers curling around hers in a gesture that felt both simple and profound. The night deepened, the stars emerging one by one in the vast expanse of sky above us. We sat there for what felt like hours, the fire burning low, the silence between us filled with everything we didn't need to say. And in that moment, I knew that this place, this time, and this connection would stay with me forever, a quiet echo of something that had changed me in ways I couldn't yet fully understand.